Season 3 of The Fairer Cents is sponsored by FreshBooks, the cloud accounting software for freelancers that's the easiest possible way to send invoices and stay on top of your accounting. Stay tuned for info on how you can get a free 30-day trial while supporting the podcast.
Welcome to The Fairer Cents.
With me, Tanya.
And me, Kara.
Women, money, and the fight to break even.
Because we give a shit. And you should too. Today, Being an Ally Part 2, How White Women Can Advocate for Women of Color.
Hey, Kara.
Hey, Tanya.
How's it going?
It is going super great, if I can be really honest.
I'm super thrilled to hear that. I'm excited to have this conversation today, but I'm also, can I confess, a little anxious about it because I think that we're going to talk about some stuff today that is a little bit tough and requires us, or at least some of us, to do a lot of soul searching in a way that is not especially fun, but I think is very necessary.
Yeah, I would say that today is probably one of our, most nuanced as well as probably most difficult episodes, which is interesting because we've covered a lot of difficult topics.
If you haven't already listened to part 1 of this series, which was about men advocating for women, episode number 24, please go back and listen to that first and then pop back over here because that one sort of sets up what we're talking about today, but it's a little bit more accessible, talking about how men can kind of get over the hurdles of not advocating for women to instead be good allies.
Today's episode is going to focus on women being allies for women, specifically white women being allies for women of color, because this whole feminist thing that we're doing operates on gradients, and we all come to feminism and to dismantling the patriarchy from different backgrounds, and we all start in different places. We are going to use some terms today that might cause some feelings for certain listeners. Specifically, we're going to use the term white feminist, which we want to be really clear up front is not a blanket term, meaning if you are a white woman who is a feminist. In my personal life, I like to use the phrase white feminist TM to differentiate between women who are white and also feminists. White feminists are people who are actively interested in advocating only for white women.
The history of the feminist movement has a pretty troubled undercurrent, particularly the push to get the vote, was outwardly racist. Susan B. Anthony, who is a hero to a lot of women, said some downright racist things. In a historical sense, I hope we can appreciate what she accomplished and also condemn the stuff that she did that was really not good. But the fact is, and why I think this is a hard conversation is because it does ask each of us to look at it. I don't think that anybody who is a white feminist TM is walking around thinking I'm a white feminist. I think instead what it is it's women advocating for other women who are just like them, have socioeconomic concerns that are a bit more upper middle class, perhaps, or a bit more suburban, or a bit more, sort of whatever stereotype you can think of. The point isn't to stereotype white women either, but to say, if you're showing up for certain things for women where it's mostly white women there, and then you're not going and showing up for things that promote the needs of women of color or disabled women or women in different circumstances from you, trans women, that your feminism is too limited. And I think it's important to recognize that because then we can grow. It's when we recognize that we can grow and be better and broaden our definition of what we want to be about, what we want to fight for.
It is about growing your feminism. It's about being inclusive. It's about being intersectional. And it's also recognizing that being an ally, like we said, today we are going to be focusing on race, but being a good ally to other women, to anyone, anywhere, is about so much more than that because we need to advocate for people along racial lines, but also along able-bodied lines, also along access lines in many, many ways. So this is just one part of our 2-part series and also one part of a much larger conversation.
I mentioned a few minutes ago that I've been a bit anxious about this one, a bit apprehensive. And a lot of that is because it's hard to talk about our own shortcomings. And I think in my case, I look at my history and it's really been a journey. So like Kara, you've identified as a feminist for a really long time. You've been out there fighting the fight for women. And I think also just giving your own background, you've had a broader sense of things for a long time. I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where this is not a joke, but when I was a kid, if you saw a Black person, someone would say like, oh, you should get their autograph because that must be a football player, a Packer. I grew up in a super white place. I grew up with a dad who raised me to not let being female be a hindrance to me. So he helped raise me to not doubt my self-confidence, to not doubt my abilities, which is all awesome. But it took me a really long time because of that to actually feel sexism, if that makes sense. Like it wasn't until like in higher education these days, women are more than half of the students. That's also true in entry-level jobs. It's not until you get sort of higher up that most people feel that really big patriarchal force. And so for me, it took until probably my late 20s, to be perfectly honest, to identify as a feminist. And I think it took much longer than that to understand that my feminism had been limited to my own experience and wasn't broad enough. I wasn't advocating enough for other women and other people in disadvantaged circumstances. And so to me, it's very much a journey, but like thinking about the journey, I'm sharing this because I want others who are not there yet or who are on the journey to feel like it's okay. None of us have to be born perfect. None of us are ever going to be perfect. It's just about continually striving to be better. And as we learn about things in the world, we take that in and we adjust our behavior. When we learn like, oh, I've only been advocating for concerns of middle class and upper middle class women who mostly happen to be white. Once I see that, I have to do better. And I'm trying to do better. And that, I think, is something that we do a lot here on the show. But anyway, that's a long way of saying like that is where my kind of anxiety around this comes from, is just that it feels very fresh for me because it's very present, because this is something that I'm pushing myself on right now.
Yeah. And listen, I applaud you for doing that. And this is a safe space. I mean, this is literally your podcast. So, yeah, I think about my own journey with feminism, and I definitely was very cognizant of feminism from a very early age. And I've just been studying it for a very long time. So I think I am more comfortable and maybe more well versed in my beliefs and in speaking to things like intersectionality than some of our listeners may be. Certainly, I have made plenty of mistakes in my past. And as our world continues to grow and change, so too do my views, will your views, Tanya, and to all our listeners. I mean, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, I think it's a good thing to be continually learning and to challenge old beliefs, and to say, do I still believe that? Why do I believe that? What are the forces at work to make me believe that? And am I comfortable with that belief? Again, this is a safe space for all our listeners. We are going to get into some spicy stuff, but it's stuff that we need to be having in order to have a conversation around true equality and certainly around financial equality.
A big reason why we said at the top of the show that you should go back and listen to episode 24, if you haven't already listened to it, is that we talked there about this question of kind of whose job is it to educate others? Is it our job as women to educate men in the sexism that exists, in the effects of the patriarchy that we feel that are invisible to a lot of men? Is it the job of women of color to educate us as white women about this stuff? I think the reality is it's not. It's up to each of us to go get that education ourselves. But that can be tricky and complicated. Something I want to put out there for this episode as kind of like a grounding thing is, if a person of color has ever said something to you that felt like criticism, or if you as a woman said something to a man that felt like criticism of his views or his behavior or his not being a good ally, if you've given that feedback, you understand that in giving that, you see potential for that person to change, and you are giving that out of, I would say, love, or at least like some belief that that person can do better, some belief in their integrity or their ability to adapt. Because it's hard to tell people that. It's hard to share your experience because that's a vulnerable thing. It's also just exhausting. That, I think, is sort of the spirit of all of this, of like some of the things that feel tough to hear. Remember that we're having this conversation so that we can all learn and be our best selves in the world.
Tanya and I are both white. I know we have a lot of white listeners, and we operate in personal finance, which is a very white space. And I do think it is important to bring these conversations to predominantly white spaces and just ask people to reflect. So that's what we're trying to do today, asking you to reflect. I spoke with Kiona, who runs the travel website How Not to Travel Like a Basic Bitch. And she also has a thriving Instagram account, also How Not to Travel Like a Basic Bitch. I semi-recently discovered Kiona, and I have been consuming her content like crazy. She tackles a lot of really hard topics with such grace, and she will be the first person to tell you that she is constantly learning and growing herself and revising some of her own beliefs. So I find her work to be a very welcoming space where people can go to learn and people can go to thrive. And just a note on the title, How Not to Travel Like a Basic Bitch. She defines basic bitch as someone who is unflinchingly upholding of the status quo and stereotypes of their privilege without realizing it. She's not saying if you drink pumpkin spice lattes, you're a basic bitch.
During the Women's March, I mean, all of the white ladies showed up. And then we have Black Lives Matter marches, and they don't show up for that. And Black Lives Matter means advocating for Black women. And if you were a true feminist, you would show up for Black women just because they're women and they experience oppression by the patriarchy just like white women. By not coming to the aid of women, period, it is participating in oppression because white women do have a privilege and do benefit from white supremacy. It's just sad when you don't see them show up for you in the ways that you would show up for them. I have done a tremendous amount of growth, and that is because it's painful when you are in a space of privilege and didn't realize that your presence or the words that you say are oppressing others even less privileged than you. So I've actually learned through my own experience oppressing other people, not directly, obviously, like I didn't mean to, but just when it was pointed out to me, I was like, whoa, I didn't realize that even my presence or what I was saying was oppressing these people. But at the same time, I realized I had no idea. When it comes to white feminism, I always try to approach it with empathy and giving the benefit of the doubt that white women don't walk in our bodies. They're not brown. It's not possible for them to understand the feeling of being a brown woman. I want to say that it's not your fault because it's just not your experience. What is a problem is when it is I feel like so many brown women put in the effort to educate white women or white spaces or advocate for themselves or are basically like screaming and shouting from the rooftops like, hey, we're oppressed, like we need to be recognized. And when it's ignored, that to me is violent. I just want to say that it's not a white woman's fault not to know, but it is a white woman's fault that once they know, they can no longer be ignorant to that issue.
I know this is something that you do and that you advocate for, and something that I see a lot of people of color saying is, you can tip me. You can tip me for my education here because I'm doing the work of dismantling these systems and of educating you. And this takes time and resources from me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I always thought it was really odd when people would ask for money because I'm like, you're just advocating for yourself. Why are we accepting money for that? And I just didn't really understand it until I came into this space, and it has taken so much labor, so much time. It's like a full-time job, like fielding inquiries and questions and then receiving a lot of hate and violence by people who just don't understand, or it's not something that they walk in. So they like criticize you for it. Or when you point out oppression, you're like, hey, I'm oppressed. They're like, well, they think that you just saying that is oppressing to them. And then that's just like a lot of emotional labor. And then I was like, you know what? I shouldn't actually have to be doing this work. Like the fact that brown women have to do this, because if we don't, then it risks our lives, our jobs, our salaries, it risks our health, both mentally and physically. And the fact that we have to put in the extra work, time, money, just to have the equal rights requires some sort of compensation from people who you would assume don't want this to proliferate in society. it does require some sort of payment because it's emotional labor and time. Like the fact that white women have the time to like go on about their lives without speaking on their oppression to the degree that brown women do just gives them so much added time to do other things, to make money, to create community. But this isn't just with white women. I mean, I have learned so much from the indigenous community who's so oppressed in so many different ways than the rest of us. And I have paid all of my teachers because I was like, wow, I had no idea that you were experiencing this. And the fact that you took the time and also like re-traumatize themselves, right? Like in their process of telling me about their own oppression, people being murdered, their aunts and cousins like being sterilized by the US government or being murdered and going missing. I mean, that's just hard in and of itself to talk about, let alone like to offer me the time and the emotional labor and trauma to just go over that trauma just so that I can learn and be a more informed human.
This historical trauma, as well as this idea of who has access to money, who has access to free time, because it's like we both have jobs, right? Like we're both putting in work and making money. And then you're spending your free time educating these people, and I'm spending my free time recharging and resting and with my friends. I mean, those are two very different lives. You're not getting that recharge time, and your emotional bandwidth is being spent on trying to face down racists with compassion. You know what I mean? That's got to be the most difficult work out there.
Yes, yes.
You speak a lot on your Instagram about the intersectionality of freedom and about the degrees of privilege. Can you speak to things like how a history of colonialism plays into our current system? And what does that mean for things like generational wealth?
Basically, our history books were all colonized. Like, I mean, not just history, like our museums, our anthropologists, our archaeologists, everything that we know today has been told through a white lens, or at least a global north lens. A lot of history has just started when colonization occurred and completely left out, you know, before Columbus, and that there was like millennia of history of brown people. And like it only starts in like, you know, 500 years ago when Columbus came or Cortez came or whatever. I think what's most important to me is like, yes, we should understand that the history has been colonized, but most importantly, history shouldn't be understood in a vacuum.
That is what really gets me about some white feminists, because they see it through my experience is this. And I'm not thinking about the global perspective or even just the broader national perspective. And I think that's so harmful for not just feminists, but any group of people, because when you erase things, you do yourself a disservice because you're erasing knowledge that could be useful to you, and you erase entire peoples. Oh my gosh, I'm just getting like so angry over here.
And I feel like it can't be ignored because, I mean, our generations build on each other. And I think that's just a fact, you know, regarding trauma, that those are passed on. I mean, I'm a scientist, and it's even passed on in your DNA. Trauma is not only passed on orally, mentally, and physically, but it's passed on financially. And I know you talked about generational wealth, but it's like when you're discussing economies, we need to discuss them generationally because policies build on each other. So like you said, you know, it started in the Reagan era when, you know, Honduras was being exploited for their fruits and bananas. And now, fast forward, you know, multiple presidencies later, now we have Hondurans seeking asylum because of those things. That started so many years ago. So it's just not appropriate to ignore the hand that gets played generations before and what it causes today. And then also addressing generational privilege. So white people have access to generational wealth that started since the beginning of colonization. You know, they had access to things that we didn't have access to, and they've built on that. So because generational wealth is inaccessible to POC on a systematic level, we can't create policies without addressing generational wealth and how it's associated with skin color or white supremacy. The wealth of just information. Like white families have such wealth of information on how the system works, right? And it works for them. Like talking about investments and stocks and bonds. When I talk to my white friends, they've already invested. They've already have things set up or things in place to build on their wealth. If you talk to a lot of brown families, I'm not saying all, some people have understood, but that's not even in our consciousness. It's not even in our consciousness to address like buying a home, what that means, what marriage means for your finances, what it means to invest, have a portfolio. It's like we weren't taught that from our parents. And then not until you like come into white spaces do you realize that there's this whole world out there that builds on wealth that you already have and that you can survive off of that via passive income or just like investing smartly. Dang, like I wish I had that knowledge or somebody to walk me through it, or just somebody who has done it before and done it well and been successful and then was able to pass that on. Like, because POCs don't have that and we're like taught not to talk about money, we're just out of the loop, or we're not given access to the information, or we don't even, maybe the information is out there, but we don't even know it's out there to look for it. And so I feel like there's so much power in just like information and passing on knowledge.
Running a business of one means you wear many hats: marketer, content creator, CEO, office custodian. There are many things that demand your attention, and you need all the assistance you can get.
That's why cloud accounting software FreshBooks is so cool. They take the work out of getting paid so you can focus on doing the work you need to keep your business running. With FreshBooks, you can create a customized invoice, track all your income, and link a business credit card to automatically track business spending.
FreshBooks makes it super simple to do your accounting. The website is clean and easy to understand, and it makes accounting one less thing that you need to worry about as a business owner.
Most accounting services come with lots of bells and whistles that you don't need as a freelancer, and FreshBooks cuts all of that out to make it as easy to use as possible. We've both used it and can attest to it being the easiest possible way to do your accounting, and maybe the prettiest.
Plus, FreshBooks has recently gotten into the events game, which you know I love, with their hashtag #IMakeALiving events around the US. They talk to freelancers and small business owners about how they make a living, which is something that we both think is pretty cool.
Head to freshbooks.com/TFC to claim your 30-day free trial and enter the fairer cents in the How Did You Hear About Us section. It's a win-win. You get something free while supporting the fairer cents. Join the 24 million people who've used FreshBooks already. That's freshbooks.com/TFC.
I also spoke with Marivette, who runs the website The Mujerista, which is an online platform for Latinx peoples to share their stories and experiences. I have written for The Mujerista and I have spoken with Mari several times, and she is just someone who I really delight in knowing and who is doing really amazing work on the ground and online, creating more spaces for more people of Latinx descent to see themselves. Her work is very intersectional and I admire it a lot.
They fail to sort of connect that perhaps I should step away from a certain conversation and allow somebody from a different marginalized or minority group step in and hold that conversation and be sort of the leader or more representative of a conversation, marginalized groups. That's where it becomes a problem, and that's where white feminism exists.
So you and I have talked a little bit privately about how we believe that spending money at businesses owned by women of color can be just like a way to diversify our spending, diversify our business landscape, and support, like truly financially support women of color. Why do you think that's important? And what is the impact that when someone spends money at the Mujerista, if they get one of your t-shirts or something, what is that impact on your life?
It's the growth of Latinx-owned businesses have been outpacing any other demographic, and yet we are still facing some significant barriers when it comes to getting our businesses funded by banks especially. And for me as a woman of color, as a business owner, that obviously affects what I'm trying to do with my project, with the Mujerista, knowing that it's harder for me to be able to fund my company. It makes me feel limited to what I can do, to my potential. And it feels as if it's going to hamper my growth. And it just makes me feel like I'm unqualified to request for a loan. And so you end up trying to find different ways to fund your projects. So like for me personally, I have been self-funded. I've been using whatever savings I have and, taking out credit cards or using credit cards to help fund what I'm on my project. And I know that's very much the same for so many other Latinx business entrepreneurs. And I'm sure it's the same for many other minority groups. And I think there was a statistic that I was reading how banks provide loans for us at a much smaller scale than, especially Latinx business owners, at a much smaller scale than other groups. It sort of creates this mindset for me of like not bothering to pick up a loan to fund my company. And another thing is that because of that, then you just don't find out that there's these other opportunities, or you don't take advantage of different programs that do exist that are offered by the government, like from the Small Business Administration. And it's because you just feel like you're already a step behind. And so why bother?
Finance in general, I'm thinking Wall Street, banks, credit unions, are really dominated by white people. And it's the same with like white feminists. I have myself gone to many events here in Austin or just when I'm traveling that are, women in business or, women entrepreneurs. And it's a lot of white people who speak to the white experience. And what we were saying earlier, they exclude, or they're not interested in including different narratives, and they're not making space for it. And that's something. And then a woman of color walks in and is like, well, actually, I have to worry about being Black and being a woman. And I guess I'm really curious, what do you want white feminists to do better when it comes to supporting women of color with their money and in public spaces?
Actually, over the weekend, went to an event, and the attendees were primarily white and the panelists were also primarily white. And being that it was in Miami, I thought it was going to be more diverse. And throughout the day, it was dawning on me just how it was not that at all. And even speaking to many of the people that attended and just getting to know them, they were people that weren't even from Miami. It was funny because I was going into this event, super excited and interested in seeing and hearing what was going to be discussed. And during the event, looking at the different discussions that they were going to have throughout the day, I realized, as you were saying, it was a feedback loop. And a lot of the discussions did not pertain, or I did not relate to them. It just was just conversations that did not address or even come close to talking about my experience as a woman of color entrepreneur and the difficulties that I face in that arena. It was hard walking away from it because it's an event that I've seen on social media so often, and I was just like, I can't wait for them to be here and come, and attending it and seeing how it just felt not at all inclusive, even though they were trying to be. And by their way of trying to be is by including a couple of women of color in the panels. And it's great. It's a step towards a good direction when you're being more inclusive with the panelists that you're inviting. But when the discussions that are being had do not at all speak on the plight of a woman of color or the difficulties that they're going to face in the real world with trying to obtain loans from banks or just getting their business off the ground or figuring out where the resources are for them, then for me, the event ends up being just like a kumbaya, let's all be proud that we're supporting each other. And that to me is sort of like white feminism in itself. So that was the event for me. And so when I left the event and I spoke to my girlfriend that came with me, we were talking about how we were a bit disappointed and just trying to figure out why were we disappointed? What could they have done better? And it dawned on me that it was that there were no actual discussions being had about the issues that Latinas or Black women face or LGBTQ members face. It was just a very general conversation that was had. And it sort of defeats the purpose of including a diverse panel if you're not going to have a diverse topic of conversation.
It's not just having a woman of color on the panel, it's making space for that woman of color's experience. Like, oh, okay, we're talking about raising money. Well, you had to walk into the room as a Black woman. What did that feel like staring down a bunch of white men? Were you, self-conscious about your skin color? Because like a white woman walking into a room of all white men, you're going to be self-conscious about your gender, but you're not going to be self-conscious about your race. You're just not.
And that is a great point to bring up. And that's also something that sort of gets lost when I'm around a primarily white group of people, I do feel self-conscious. I feel insecure. Do I sound smart? Does my accent, can you hear my accent more? Am I speaking, or do I sound intelligent? I don't know. Like, I don't think people do realize that that is something that sometimes women of color do face and do experience. And it's so great that you talked on that when it comes to a woman of color entering into the business world. And sometimes that could hurt your plan or what you're trying to achieve.
In the US right now, Latinos in particular, fastest growing demographic in the country. The country is getting browner. I work in Austin in the Latina business community a fair amount, and I'm always very conscious of how can I lend my voice and my platform and my support without taking away from the voices and the experiences that women of color are having. And I think that's a big block that a lot of well-meaning white women have. They're like, okay, I want to be here. I want to do the thing. Like, I'm a good person, but they don't know how to navigate the space. How do you think white women can be true allies and advocates for women of color without taking the mic from women of color?
Invite them to the conversation. If this is a conversation that you don't necessarily pertain to, invite people from that group to come and use your platform and speak on it. Join them in the conversation and do your best to just listen. Also bring awareness to some of the issues and struggles that women of color do face, because what you see time and time again with a lot of these movements is that when there are issues arising in Black or brown communities, they seldom make the news as big as other conversations or other issues that pertain to white groups. When white women use their platform to sort of bring awareness that this is happening and then invite people from the community to come and discuss it even further, I think that would be a fantastic way to show that you are an ally, to show that you care, to show that you're not trying to co-opt the whole entire conversation or movement.
I loved both of those interviews, Kara, and I'm so glad that you could talk to both Mari and Kiona. And I loved Kiona's quote. I'm paraphrasing, but basically, it's not your fault not to know the experience of others, but once you know, you must speak up, you must do something. When I heard her say that, I was just like, yes, that's really the key. It's not about blame that you don't inherently know something. We all start from our own experience and can only experience that to a certain point. But once your eyes are opened, you can't just pretend like you didn't see what you saw.
I mean, no one comes out of the womb understanding, especially the intricacies of race relations, As you grow and learn, you need to change your behaviors to accommodate for that. And that is something that I think a lot of white people get a little tripped up on, because they feel like, oh, okay, I know X is bad, but what's my space to address that? How do I do that without, tromping all over the people of color who are already doing that work? Or something that I see a lot of white people do is they will center themselves and their feelings in a space for people of color, and don't do that. It's not about you. Understanding that I'm growing, I'm learning is one thing. And then also respecting the spaces that already exist and your role in those spaces, that's the work that I think takes a lot of time to really understand how to do gracefully.
Can you say more about centering yourself in a space that's not yours to center yourself in, just so people understand what you're saying?
And Mari spoke a little bit about this, which was great. But say, for example, you're on Instagram and a woman of color posts an experience that she had that was racist. And she says, here's why that was racist. Here's why people shouldn't do that anymore. If you as a white person come into that space and try to explain away that experience, or you try to come into that and say, you shouldn't be mad at that person for doing that racist thing. Black woman, you should meet that with love. That is centering yourself in someone else's space. You have literally entered into her area of the internet, her Instagram page, and said, your feelings are invalid. Here's how I think you should feel. Or here is me speaking over your experience with my experience. So don't do that.
Yeah, don't. That's bad. Certainly not all white feminist TM, not all white women who kind of can't see beyond their own experience aren't going into spaces of people of color and telling them how to feel or telling them how to process racism or things like that. I think an example that to me is very powerful, which I struggle to kind of process because I think there are a lot of different layers to it, but a dear friend of mine is an African-American woman, and she had the experience of going to the Women's March right after Trump was inaugurated and was excited to go, was excited to kind of fight for the sisterhood, and came away from it with a set of really bad feelings because she felt like the women there were mostly just looking out for white women, that they wouldn't also show up for a Black Lives Matter march. She and I had a really hard conversation about it, which I felt very honored that she trusted me to have this conversation, because I think that a lot of women of color don't necessarily want to tell white women kind of what the struggle is. And so that was something that meant a lot to me. But her belief coming out of it was very much that we should kind of write those women off, that the women who show up and are just interested in the interests of wealthier women or white women or suburban women or whatever it is, that they're never going to come around. And that's where I struggle with it, because I look at my own experience and I think I haven't always been the best advocate for women of color, not on purpose, just because I didn't think about it, because I hadn't sort of like opened my eyes to that experience yet. And I can say that as someone who went to Berkeley, who took classes in a lot of this kind of stuff and took African American studies classes and just did not learn what I wish I had learned. And not to say that that education was perfect, because it for sure wasn't. But in my own experience, if like going through all of that didn't help me open my eyes enough, and I had to go many, many years past that to see how my version of feminism first was late to arrive, but second was also so centered in my own experience. But then I've been able to see that, and I'm working on changing. Like that to me means I think there are more of us who can come around. And so I loved Kiona's quote for that reason, that it's not your fault not to know, but then you have a responsibility to do this. Like I don't want to write people off, at least until we give them a chance to sort of see the error of their ways and do better.
Yeah. And here is a space where I don't exactly disagree, but I think it's very difficult to quantify women whose heart is in the right place. Because if you're choosing the wrong actions and the wrong choices, even if you're a good person, it's like, yo, you're making this hard, you know? And I think that's something that we run into a lot. Like that is how I feel about my grandmother, who I love very, very much, voting for Trump. I'm like, Grandma, I love you. You're great. You actively chose the wrong choice. And I'm not cool with that. And my grandma listens to this podcast. So,
Hi, Grandma.
Hi, Grandma. Love you. But like that is a really complicated choice. And I think we see that a lot with white feminist TM, as well as white people trying to do the right thing. I don't think of myself as a bad person. I don't think lots of people, I'm not like out here running around killing people or whatever, but I'm voting for the politicians who enact racist laws, or I'm not, to Kiona's point, I'm showing up to the Women's March, but I'm not showing up to the Black Lives Matter march. And that is where we get into this very difficult gray area. And that's when people start feeling really marginalized, or like their voices don't matter, and other people start feeling defensive. And it is certainly not an easy conversation.
No, and this is to me the stickiest part is like, where do we draw that line? Because if you go to the Women's March and you don't understand that your challenges are not the same challenges faced by Black women, but then you start to realize that and you say, oh, okay, I'm going to question what I've been doing now and try to reconsider, like that's good. That's what we want. But others will sort of go like, yeah, but my interests are more important and I'm just going to fight for that. I'm going to fight for maternity leave, which I mean, that does affect all women, but on a basic level, like how about we work on the minimum wage? How about we work on programs to alleviate poverty, things that are sort of totally outside the experience of most middle class and upper middle class women. At what point do we say, okay, you're never going to come over versus like you have potential to come over? I have no idea. And I just feel on some level like I don't want to write a whole bunch of people off when potentially we could have more allies there. But I'm so lacking in answers.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult thing. And I also think though, it's a personal choice. And what's great is that, I mean, ideally this wouldn't be the case, but it is because we live in a complex world. We all have layers to our privilege, right? And so like you and I are white women out here in the world. So we can give people more chances because we have more time, more energy, and more willingness to do it. Versus if a woman of color is like, I'm not going to give people any more chances. I don't have the time and energy, and I'm fighting off marginalization in X, Y, and Z ways. Fine. That's okay. You don't need to do that. The Tanyas and the Karas of the world are out here doing that. So we all kind of share this collective activism, and we're doing it in different ways, which I think is really nice. It's all part of the feminist fight club, you know?
And that I 100% agree with, because I would never want to tell somebody else, here's the point at which you're allowed to write someone off. And until then, you just have to put up with their ignorance. I don't buy that. I mean, like, you get to decide as a woman when to write off a man because he's displayed sexism toward you. Same as like, I wouldn't tell my friend, you can't write these white women at the march off because of XYZ. Like, no, you're allowed to. I still want to fight the fight of helping to educate as many people as possible so that we will have more women go, oh, I've been a white feminist. I didn't realize I want to be intersectional in my feminism. How do I get there? What do I need to learn? And how do I educate myself? And how do I behave differently to do that? So it's more about the collective. But yeah, on the individual level, oh my gosh, no, you have to go based on your own comfort level. And it is no one's job to do the educating.
I really enjoyed my conversation, especially with Kiona, about the financial aspect of it. Kiona accepts donations for her teaching because her platform really is an education platform. And so you can tip her. But beyond that, what both Mari and Kiona noted is that within certain communities of color, there is this really huge financial literacy hole. I recently had someone reach out to me. They wanted to post on my Instagram about a money series they're doing. And she's this white woman who said, growing up with a father who was a CFP, I really feel like blah, 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 blah. She had this amazing financial education within her home. And money was something they could talk about. And that is just something that is not an experience in many homes of color. They're not talking about money. They don't understand. Or if your parents are an immigrant and they grew up in a different financial system, they come to the United States, the question really can be, how do I open a bank account? Like, what is the basic level of finances and how do I get there? Let alone, how do I maximize my donor advised fund to, really leverage the most? I mean, that is so far beyond the conception of a lot of people, specifically people of color, specifically women of color. In episode 22, you mentioned this article that you really loved that was called, I believe, Most Personal Finance Advice is for Middle Class People, Not Poor People. And it's true. A lot of the personal finance blogs and the larger outlets that write about money are assuming a base level of income and a base level of financial literacy and education, and that you'll know what terms mean and that you'll have access to a brokerage. And what was really, really hammered home for me in both of these conversations is that there are so many people out there who are not at that point. And so from a financial advocacy point of view, I'm really, really interested in using my white privilege and power and my platforms to reach those people that are being excluded from this dominant financial narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, like, any conversation about investing is automatically going to exclude a huge chunk of the population because most brokerages require you to have $5,000 minimum to open an account. Not all. There are some other ways around it, but that's sort of industry standard. And when we live in a system in which more than half of people can't come up with $400 for an emergency without going into further debt, how are we expecting huge numbers of people to come up with $5,000 to start an investment account? That's just not the reality. So recognizing that we're talking to a small slice of people when we talk about investing, I think is really important. And same with, if you're pushing for policies at work, there are policies that are universal, like paid maternity leave, paid parental leave, but especially maternity leave does help all women. But we've also got a system in which women are much more likely to work minimum wage jobs, in which there's no such thing as any sort of paid leave. If you are not working, you are not getting paid. And so can we fight for a higher minimum wage? Can we fight for universal vacation time? Can we fight for paid sick leave mandated, which is currently not the way that things are? Those are things that are going to help all women, and particularly the ones who are worse off, where, fighting for a higher 401k match, like, yes, that is significant. That is important. But there are things way, way down the chain that affect much larger numbers of women, and particularly women who really need that advocacy, need that allyship.
How we talk about money at any level is going to be impacted by our womanhood, and for women of color, by their race. And it is that intersection that I feel is often overlooked. And again, Mari had this amazing story to share about how she went to an event where really it exercised tokenism. Oh, well, we have a woman of color on the panel, but we're not actually asking her about her lived experiences or about how she faced challenges that the white women on the panel did not face. And it's such an easy fix. It is to just take a step back and say, okay, if I'm going to have a panel of 3 women and there's going to be a Black woman, a Latinx woman, and a white woman, what are some questions that I can ask each of them that speak to their individual experiences? I mean, that's truly all it takes. Instead of just saying, here's my experience, I'm going to put it on them as my panelists. I mean, you have them here for a reason, right? Why wouldn't you want to ask them about their world, their experiences, their tips, their advice, their challenges? And then transferring it out of an event context, why wouldn't you want to follow women of color on your Instagram and on your Twitter and to learn from them and about them, so you can expand your own knowledge? I think it's very important that we make space, that white feminists, TM, make space for other narratives and stories, and understand that another person's lived experience and just existence is not an attack on you. It's just them sharing their existence. Once again, we're not here to yell at you. But Kara, I really want y'all to hopefully leave this podcast with some food for thought, and to just think about what you are consuming, who you are advocating for, and why you are making those choices. So covered a lot of ground today, but I'm really proud of us. And Tanya, I want to say I'm really proud of you. Thank you for being so raw here on the show.
Gosh, I mean, I don't even feel like I talked that much about like the really hard stuff, because this is something that, I'm spending a lot of time kind of revisiting my past and thinking like, oh gosh, I wish I had done this in this setting, or I could have done this in that setting, which is probably not super useful. The right thing to do is to just focus on moving forward. A big goal of mine this year is to have Sense Positive be more diverse. It was really nicely diverse in a way that was lovely to see. But given that we're talking to women for whom financial independence is an option, that's sort of going to be looking at higher socioeconomic tiers, which is going to skew more white, but like that's not good enough. We need better representation from different groups. So that's a goal of mine. But thinking about that here on the podcast too, of making sure that we're as diverse as we can be with guests, is really important. But anyway, yeah, it's something that I'm thinking about a lot and spending a lot of time on. And so I'm glad we could talk about it here in a safe space.
Yes, always a safe space. And we want to hear your thoughts. I am sure y'all have thoughts. So please email us, fairsense@gmail.com. We are also on Twitter and Instagram. If you are like, ugh, who can write a whole email? You can just slide into our DMs or tweet at us. We are at FairSense on both of those platforms.
And as always, you can visit our website, see show notes, see lovely pictures of us, all that good stuff. That's thefairersense.com. And if you dug this episode, if you love the show, generally, we'd be so honored if you'd leave us either just a quick star rating or a review on whatever platform you use. That means so much, and it really, really helps the show.
Ooh, Okay, let's all exhale together, unclench, listeners. And we are sending you love and positive vibes. Group hug. I'm literally hugging the air above my pillow.
Group hug, group hug. It's funny because my friend who I mentioned, who really shared some raw personal stuff with me, she told me that she can't listen to this podcast in the mornings when she's commuting to work because she needs to laugh in the morning, and this show makes her cry.
Oh my gosh.
And I have a feeling that this episode, which is my part of it anyway, is very inspired by her. I suspect she won't want to listen to it in the commute, but I hope that, if you're still listening, you've made it this far. So congratulations. Please go listen to some comedy podcast next or something like that.
Go look at like a very beautiful person's face. Like I look at Will Smith's face, but you can do whatever.
Or like go on Twitter and look at Thoughts of Dog or something like that.
Love Thoughts of Dog.
Cat videos, something just like unadulterated joy with no political ramifications.
That's right. That's right. Do something rad. And until next episode, stay rad.
Stay rad. The Fairer Scents are Kara Perez and me, Tanya Hester. Editing by me. Our theme song is by The Insider. All other music appears courtesy of the generous and mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. If you need music to license for your podcast or other project, check them out at breakmastercylinder.bandcamp.com. You can always find me at ournextlife.com and Kara at bravelygo.co.